The autumn sun was just peeking over the horizon as Judge Evelyn Carter's alarm buzzed at 5:30 a.m. She had always been an early riser, a habit ingrained from watching her grandmother wake up before dawn to prepare for her job as a school teacher. The familiar scent of coffee filled her kitchen as she stood by the window, taking in the peaceful morning view of her backyard, where the leaves were starting to turn golden. Another day to make a difference, she whispered to herself, a morning ritual that had started during her first year as a judge. At 52, she had seen enough in her courtroom to know that each day brought its own unique challenges and opportunities to impact lives. As she got ready, her mind wandered to the cases scheduled for the day. There was a complicated custody battle that had been weighing on her heart, two parents fighting over their children, both convinced they were doing what was best. She had spent the previous evening reviewing the case files, making sure she understood every detail. The morning routine was like a well-choreographed dance. 15 years on the bench had taught her the importance of starting each day with a clear mind. She picked out her favorite charcoal gray suit, the one she had worn when she was first sworn in as a judge. It still fit perfectly, and somehow wearing it always gave her an extra boost of confidence. Her breakfast was simple but nourishing: whole grain toast with avocado, a hard-boiled egg, and her second cup of coffee. As she ate, she scrolled through her emails, noting a message from her sister about their upcoming family reunion. Family had always been her anchor, especially during the tough early years of her career, when she was often the only black woman in the courthouse. The drive to work was her time for reflection. Her car radio played soft jazz, a reminder of Sunday afternoons when her father would fill their home with the sounds of John Coltrane and Miles Davis. The familiar route to the Montgomery County Courthouse took her past the elementary school where her mother had taught for 30 years. Even now, years after her mother's retirement, seeing the school always brought a smile to her face. The courthouse parking lot was nearly empty when she arrived, just the way she liked it. The early morning silence gave her time to prepare mentally for the day ahead. She could see Mr. Thompson, the elderly maintenance worker, going about his morning duties. They exchanged their usual friendly waves, a small gesture that had become part of both their routines over the years. Walking toward the courthouse, she paused to admire the building's classical architecture. The stone steps had been worn smooth by decades of footsteps, lawyers, judges, defendants, plaintiffs, all seeking justice in their own way. The morning dew made the granite glisten, and the crisp autumn air carried the scent of nearby maple trees. She thought about how far she'd come from her first day here as a young law clerk, fresh out of law school. Back then, the massive bronze doors had seemed intimidating. Now they felt like old friends welcoming her home. Her heels clicked against the marble floor as she made her way to the security entrance, the sound echoing in the empty corridor. Her leather briefcase held the day's files, each one representing someone's story, someone's life. She had learned early in her career that behind every case number was a human being with hopes, fears, and dreams. This understanding had shaped her approach to justice, firm but compassionate, always mindful of the human element in every legal decision. The morning light streamed through the tall windows, creating patterns on the polished floor. She remembered how her grandmother used to say that morning light had a special kind of magic. It made everything look new and full of possibility. Even after all these years, that morning light still filled her with a sense of purpose. Her chambers were exactly as she had left them the previous evening. The walls lined with law books told the story of her journey, from the well-worn copy of the state constitution her father had given her when she passed the bar exam, to the recent editions on international law. Family photos shared space with her degrees and certifications, creating a perfect blend of the personal and professional. As she settled into her chair, she pulled out her journal, a habit she had maintained since her first day on the bench. In it, she recorded not just the facts of cases, but the human moments that reminded her why she had chosen this path. Today's entry would start like all the others, with gratitude for the opportunity to serve justice. She could hear the courthouse coming to life around her. The shuffle of feet in the hallway, the distant ding of the elevator, the murmur of voices as staff arrived for the day. Soon, these halls would be filled with people, each carrying their own stories, their own hopes for justice. Opening her laptop, she began reviewing the day's docket. The custody case was scheduled for 10 a.m., followed by several criminal hearings. Each case file represented real people with real problems, waiting for solutions. She had learned that justice wasn't just about applying the law, it was about understanding the human stories behind each case. The morning sun had risen higher now, warming her office through the tall windows. She could see the Courthouse plaza below starting to fill with people. Lawyers clutching coffee cups, clients arriving early, court officers taking their positions. From her vantage point, it looked like a carefully orchestrated dance, each person playing their part in the daily pursuit of justice. As she reviewed her notes, she thought about the young law students who sometimes visited her courtroom. She always told them the same thing, that being a judge was more than knowing the law, it was about understanding people. Every case that came before her was an opportunity to show that justice could be both fair and compassionate. The clock on her wall showed 7:45 a.m., almost time for her morning meeting with her clerk. But first, she took a moment to straighten her judge's robe, hanging ready on its stand. The simple black garment represented not just authority, but responsibility. The responsibility to ensure that everyone who entered her courtroom was treated with dignity and respect. A gentle knock at her door signaled the start of another day in the life of Judge Evelyn Carter. She took a deep breath, smoothed her suit, and prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Little did she know that this ordinary morning would soon become anything but routine. The familiar weight of her credentials around her neck reminded her of the day she received them, a proud moment shared with her family. These same credentials had opened doors throughout her career, symbolic of the hard work and dedication that had brought her to this position. As she approached the courthouse entrance, she felt the same sense of purpose that had guided her throughout her 15 years on the bench. Who could have guessed that this typical autumn morning, with its golden sunlight and crisp air, would become a defining moment not just in her career, but in the ongoing story of justice and equality in their community? The stage was set for an encounter that would test her character, challenge her principles, and ultimately lead to lasting change. The morning had started like any other at the Montgomery County Courthouse, but everything changed in those few tense moments at the security checkpoint. Officer James Miller was new to his post, having transferred from a small rural precinct just 2 weeks earlier. He stood at the entrance, his posture rigid and his expression stern as people began filtering into the building. The air was crisp, and the morning bustle was picking up as lawyers, court staff, and citizens made their way up the courthouse steps. The security line moved steadily, everyone following the familiar routine of showing credentials and passing through the metal detectors. That's when the atmosphere suddenly shifted. Judge Carter approached the entrance, her credentials displayed as they had been countless times before. She wore her usual professional attire, a well-tailored suit that reflected her position and years of service. But something was different today. Officer Miller's eyes narrowed as she approached, his hand raising to stop her despite the clearly visible judicial credentials around her neck. "Hold it right there," he barked, his voice carrying an edge that made nearby people turn their heads. "I need to see some additional identification." His tone was unnecessarily harsh, a stark contrast to the respectful manner he had shown to others passing through just moments before. The judge's response was calm and measured, years of courtroom experience evident in her composed demeanor. "Officer, I'm Judge Carter. These are my judicial credentials." She held them up again, the morning light catching the official seal. The credentials were unmistakable, the same type every judge in the building wore. But Miller wasn't backing down. "Anyone could get those made," he scoffed, his voice getting louder. "I need real ID." By now, other courthouse employees had started to notice the commotion. A young law clerk stopped in her tracks, coffee cup frozen halfway to her lips. Two attorneys who had been discussing a case fell silent, watching the scene unfold. The situation escalated when Judge Carter reached into her bag to get her driver's license, hoping to resolve the matter quickly. Officer Miller's reaction was immediate and aggressive. "Don't move," he shouted, grabbing her arm with unnecessary force. The sound of her briefcase hitting the floor echoed through the marble lobby. Several gasps rose from the growing crowd. A court reporter who had worked with Judge Carter for years stepped forward, then hesitated, unsure how to intervene. The judge remained remarkably composed, though anyone looking closely could see her hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the effort of maintaining her dignity in the face of such treatment. "Officer," she said, her voice steady and clear, "you are currently assaulting a sitting judge of this court. I suggest you remove your hand from my arm immediately." Her words carried the weight of 15 years on the bench, each syllable measured and precise. But Miller's grip only tightened. "You people always think you're above the rules," he sneered, the racial undertone in his words unmistakable. The lobby fell completely silent, the kind of heavy silence that comes before a storm. Court security cameras whirred overhead, recording every moment. A young intern fumbled with her phone, torn between documenting the incident and calling for help. The morning sun streaming through the high windows cast harsh shadows across the scene, as if nature itself was highlighting the injustice unfolding. Other officers stationed nearby began moving toward the entrance, their faces showing a mix of shock and embarrassment at their colleagues' behavior. They had worked with Judge Carter for years, knew her reputation for fairness and integrity. The disconnect between Miller's treatment and the reality of who she was couldn't have been more stark. Through it all, Judge Carter maintained her composure, though her heart was racing. She had faced discrimination before, as a law student, as a young attorney, even occasionally as a judge. But never so blatantly, never in her own courthouse, never in front of so many witnesses who knew exactly who she was and what she had accomplished. The growing crowd included defendants waiting for their hearings, courthouse staff arriving for work, and attorneys preparing for morning sessions. Each person who witnessed the scene represented another thread in the tapestry of justice that Judge Carter had worked so hard to weave throughout her career. The irony of facing such prejudice at the very steps of justice wasn't lost on anyone present. More security personnel approached, their movements careful but purposeful. The tension in the air was palpable, like static before a lightning strike. Miller's behavior had crossed so many lines, professional, ethical, legal, that the only question was who would step in first to stop it. Judge Carter could feel the eyes of everyone in the lobby. She thought about all the times she had spoken to young law students about maintaining their dignity in the face of adversity. Now she was living those words in the most public way possible. Her response in these next few moments would echo far beyond this morning, far beyond these courthouse walls. The whispers had started among the onlookers. Some recognized her from cases she had presided over, others from her community work and public speaking engagements. The contrast between her known character and the treatment she was receiving made the scene even more shocking. Miller's next words came out as a sneer. "You need to learn your place." The collective intake of breath from the crowd was audible. In that moment, it wasn't just about one officer or one judge. It was about every person who had ever faced discrimination and had to choose how to respond. The morning light continued to stream through the windows, highlighting the scene like a spotlight on a stage. What happened next would be remembered and retold countless times in the days and weeks to come. The security cameras kept rolling, documenting every second of this pivotal moment in the courthouse's history. Time seemed to slow down as Judge Carter prepared to respond. Her years of experience, her dedication to justice, and her unwavering belief in the dignity of every person were about to be put to the ultimate test. The next few moments would transform a terrible situation into a powerful lesson about justice, dignity, and the ongoing struggle for equality in America's institutions. The tension in the courthouse lobby had reached a breaking point. Officer Miller's grip on Judge Carter's arm tightened even further as she calmly repeated her identity. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floor, and the growing crowd of witnesses stood frozen, watching the unthinkable unfold before them. "I said you're not getting in," Miller growled, his face reddening with each word. His hand was leaving visible marks on the judge's sleeve, wrinkling the carefully pressed fabric of her suit jacket. The credentials around her neck caught the light, the official seal of the court clearly visible to everyone except the one person who refused to acknowledge it. A young public defender who had appeared in Judge Carter's courtroom just yesterday took a hesitant step forward, then another. She opened her mouth to speak, but the judge gave her a subtle shake of the head. This moment, as painful as it was, needed to play out. Sometimes the most powerful response to ignorance is to let it display itself fully in the light of day. The click of shoes on marble echoed through the lobby as more people arrived for the morning docket, each new arrival stopping short at the sight before them. A court clerk whispered urgently into her phone, while another staff member rushed toward the security office. The normal morning bustle of the courthouse had come to a complete standstill. "You're making a serious mistake, officer," Judge Carter said, her voice steady despite the circumstance. The words carried no threat, just a simple statement of fact. She had presided over enough cases to know how this would end, not just for this morning, but for Officer Miller's career and potentially for the entire courthouse security system. That's when Miller made his biggest mistake. With a sneer that seemed to curl up from somewhere deep and dark, he spat out words that would later be quoted in every report of the incident. "I don't care if you think you're the Queen of England. Your kind doesn't give orders here." The collective gasp from the onlookers was audible. A senior attorney who had practiced law for 40 years dropped his briefcase, the sound echoing off the high ceiling. Time seemed to slow down as those words hung in the air, heavy with generations of prejudice and hate. Through the windows, you could see more courthouse staff gathering on the steps outside, drawn by the commotion. The morning light caught the glass in the lobby doors, creating prism effects that scattered rainbow colors across the floor, a stark contrast to the ugly scene unfolding. Judge Carter felt every eye in the lobby on her. She thought about her grandmother, who had cleaned these very courthouse floors at night while studying for her teaching degree by day. She thought about her father, who had taught her that dignity wasn't something others could take from you, it was something you carried inside. The security cameras continued their silent witness as Miller's tirade continued. His voice grew louder, bouncing off the marble walls, each word digging his professional grave deeper. "You people always think you are special, always playing the judge card, the race card." A senior court officer finally broke through his frozen shock and started moving toward them. He had worked with Judge Carter for over a decade, had seen her mentor young lawyers, show compassion to troubled defendants, and maintain the highest standards of judicial conduct. The look on his face showed he could hardly believe what he was witnessing. The judge remained still, her posture straight despite Miller's grip on her arm. Her eyes never left his face, calm and steady, watching as he revealed more about himself with every passing second. She had seen this kind of anger before, in her courtroom and in life. She knew it came from a place of fear. Fear of change, fear of losing power, fear of a world that was moving forward whether people like Miller were ready or not. More phones had appeared in the crowd, recording the incident. Tomorrow, these videos would spread across social media, sparking discussions about racism, abuse of power, and the justice system. But right now, in this moment, it was just about one person maintaining their dignity while another lost all of his. The morning sun had risen higher now, streaming directly through the high windows. It illuminated the scene like a spotlight. Officer Miller's reddened face, Judge Carter's composed expression, the crowd of witnesses standing in stunned silence. The light seemed to emphasize every detail, as if to ensure that nothing about this moment would be forgotten. Miller's hand tightened one last time on the judge's arm. "I should arrest you for trying to breach security," he threatened, his voice shaking with anger. It was clear to everyone present that he had completely lost control of the situation, of his professional judgment, of himself. A maintenance worker who had known Judge Carter for years wiped tears from his eyes as he watched. He had often told people how she always greeted him by name, asked about his family, treated him with the same respect she showed to fellow judges. Now he watched helplessly as she faced this humiliation with the same grace she brought to everything else. The chief of Courthouse security was pushing through the crowd now, his face a mask of horror as he took in the scene. Behind him, several other officers moved into position, ready to intervene. The moment had reached its peak, and something had to give. Judge Carter could feel the bruise forming on her arm, could hear the whispers and murmurs from the crowd, could sense the violent tension radiating from Officer Miller. But still, she didn't move, didn't raise her voice, didn't give him the reaction he seemed to be seeking. Her response would come, but not in the way he expected. The morning light caught her judicial pin, sending a flash across the lobby. That small piece of metal represented everything she had worked for, everything she stood for. It was a symbol of justice, the very thing being tested in this moment. The scene was set for what would come next, a response that would transform this ugly moment into something powerful and lasting. The courthouse held its breath, waiting to see how this judge, known for her wisdom and fairness, would handle the most personal case she had ever faced in these halls of justice. The courthouse lobby had become eerily quiet. Even the usual sounds of shuffling papers and whispered conversations had died away. Officer Miller's grip was still tight on Judge Carter's arm, but something in the atmosphere had shifted. It was the kind of silence that comes before a thunderclap, before a moment that changes everything. Judge Carter took a deep breath, drawing on 15 years of courtroom experience and a lifetime of facing down prejudice with dignity. When she spoke, her voice was clear and steady, carrying to every corner of the marble lobby without being raised. The power in her words came not from volume, but from their truth. "Officer Miller," she began, each word precisely chosen, "I am Judge Evelyn Carter of the Third Circuit Court." She paused, letting her title and position sink in. "Your actions today reflect not just on you, but on the entire justice system we are all sworn to uphold." The morning sunlight streamed through the high windows, casting her shadow long across the floor. The crowd watched, transfixed, as she continued to speak with unwavering composure. Miller's grip on her arm had loosened slightly, though his face still showed defiance. "In my courtroom, every person who enters is treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their race, background, or position," she continued. "That principle doesn't stop at my courtroom door. It extends to every corner of this building, including this very spot where you're standing." A young law clerk in the crowd wiped away tears. She had chosen to intern at this courthouse specifically because of Judge Carter's reputation for fairness and integrity. Now she was watching her mentor demonstrate those qualities in the most challenging circumstances imaginable. "Your badge and your position come with power," Judge Carter said, her eyes locked with Miller's. "But they also come with responsibility. The same responsibility I carry when I put on my robes each morning." Her words seemed to echo off the marble walls, reaching every person in the growing crowd. Miller's face had begun to change. The angry red flush was fading, replaced by something that looked almost like uncertainty. The hand gripping her arm trembled slightly, but Judge Carter wasn't finished. "What you're doing right now isn't about security or protocol," she continued, her voice taking on the same measured tone she used when delivering important rulings. "It's about fear and prejudice. And in this courthouse, in any courthouse, that is unacceptable." The chief of Courthouse security had finally reached them, his face a mix of horror and embarrassment. But Judge Carter raised her free hand slightly, signaling him to wait. This moment needed to be more than just about removing one officer from his post. "I could have you arrested right now for assault," she said, her words carrying no trace of threat or anger, just simple fact. "I could end your career with a single phone call, but that's not justice. Justice isn't about revenge or punishment, it's about learning, understanding, and growing." Several of the lawyers in the crowd nodded. They had heard her express similar sentiments from the bench, but seeing her live these principles in such a personal situation was something else entirely. "So instead, Officer Miller, I'm going to do what I do every day in my courtroom. I'm going to make sure this incident leads to positive change." Her voice took on a tone of authority that had nothing to do with her position and everything to do with her character. The morning light had shifted, creating a kind of glow around her as she spoke. "Your actions today will be addressed, not through violence or hatred, but through the proper channels of justice, the very system I have sworn to uphold and that you have sworn to protect." Miller's hand finally fell away from her arm. The red marks his fingers had left stood out against her skin, but her posture remained perfectly straight, her dignity intact. The silence in the lobby was complete, every person present knowing they were witnessing something extraordinary. "This moment isn't just about you and me," she continued. "It's about every person who walks through these doors seeking justice. It's about the principles this building represents. It's about what we choose to do when faced with prejudice and fear." A maintenance worker who had paused his morning routine to watch whispered "Amen" under his breath. Others in the crowd nodded, some wiping away tears, others standing straighter as if drawing strength from her words. "I want you to look around this lobby," Judge Carter said, her gesture encompassing the diverse crowd of witnesses. "Every person here is part of the justice system. Every person here deserves respect. Every person here has the right to feel safe and dignified within these walls." Miller's eyes darted around the lobby, seeming to truly see the crowd for the first time. The shame on his face was now evident, but Judge Carter wasn't speaking just to him anymore. Her words were for everyone present, and for all those who would hear about this moment in the days to come. "What happens next will not be about punishment," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "It will be about education, about understanding, about making sure that no one else experiences what I've experienced today. Because that's what real justice looks like." The morning sun had risen higher now, warming the lobby with its light. Judge Carter stood in that light, her presence commanding respect not through force or position, but through the strength of her character and the power of her response to injustice. The crowd remained silent, but the atmosphere had transformed. What had started as a moment of ugly prejudice had become something else entirely, a lesson in dignity, in justice, and in the power of responding to hatred with wisdom and grace. Judge Carter smoothed her sleeve where Miller's grip had wrinkled it, a simple gesture that seemed to signal the end of her speech. But her words would echo through the courthouse long after this moment passed, changing policies, attitudes, and hearts in ways that mere punishment never could. Word of what happened at the courthouse entrance spread like wildfire through the building. Within minutes of Judge Carter's powerful response, the lobby had transformed from a scene of tension to a hub of urgent activity. The chief of Courthouse security, his face still showing traces of shock, immediately removed Officer Miller from his post. The morning sun continued to stream through the high windows, but now it illuminated a very different scene. Court staff moved with purpose, documenting what had happened. A young clerk who had witnessed everything was already typing up her account, her fingers flying over her keyboard as she tried to capture every detail while it was still fresh in her mind. District Attorney Wilson rushed down from his third-floor office, his tie slightly askew in his haste. He had known Judge Carter for over a decade, had tried cases in her courtroom, had seen her handle the most difficult situations with grace. But this was different. This was personal, and the look on his face showed he understood the gravity of what had just occurred. "Judge Carter," he said, approaching her with evident concern. "My office is at your disposal, whatever you need." His words carried the weight of both professional respect and personal outrage at what had happened to his colleague. But the judge was already thinking bigger than personal retribution. She stood in the lobby, now surrounded by senior court officials, her presence commanding attention without effort. The red marks on her arm were beginning to fade, but the impact of what had happened would leave a much more lasting mark on the courthouse. "We need to call an emergency meeting," she said, her voice calm but filled with purpose. "Not just about this incident, but about the larger issues it represents." She looked around at the faces of her colleagues, many of whom she had worked with for years. This is an opportunity for real change. The courthouse photographer, who usually spent his days documenting evidence and taking official portraits, had captured the entire incident. His hands shook slightly as he reviewed the images on his camera. Each photo told part of the story: the aggression, the dignity, the transformation of a moment of hate into a catalyst for change. In a quiet corner of the lobby, a veteran court officer was consoling a young intern who had witnessed everything. "I've worked here for 20 years, he said softly, "and I've never seen anything like it. But I've also never seen anyone handle something so awful with such grace." Judge Carter's clerk approached nervously, holding the day's docket. "Judge, your first case is scheduled for," she began, but the chief judge was already waving her off. "We'll need to reschedule today's cases," the chief judge announced. "What happened this morning takes precedence." He turned to Judge Carter. "Unless you prefer to take some time." But she shook her head. "The work of justice doesn't stop," she said firmly. "But we need to make sure it works for everyone." She glanced at the growing crowd of courthouse staff, lawyers, and citizens who were still gathering in the lobby. What happened here today happens to people every day, in and out of courthouses. They just don't usually have an audience. The courthouse security team was huddled near their office, their faces showing a mix of shame and determination. One of them was already pulling up training protocols on a computer, marking sections that needed immediate revision. Another was on the phone with the police department, his voice low but intense as he reported the incident. A senior judge who had mentored Judge Carter early in her career made his way through the crowd. His eyes were wet as he reached her. "I taught you law," he said quietly, but you just taught all of us something far more important. The morning light had shifted again, creating long shadows across the lobby floor. Someone had brought Judge Carter a cup of tea, which sat untouched on a nearby desk. She was too busy talking with court administrators, already outlining changes that needed to be made. "We need immediate revisions to security protocols," she was saying, her voice carrying the same authority it held in her courtroom. "But more than that, we need to look at the culture that made this possible. Every person who walks through these doors, whether they're a judge or a defendant, deserves to be treated with dignity." Outside the courthouse, news vans were beginning to arrive. The story was spreading beyond the building's walls. A court officer who had witnessed everything was already receiving text messages from friends at other courthouses, asking if it was true about what had happened to Judge Carter. The maintenance worker who had witnessed everything was quietly polishing the brass railings near the entrance, but his eyes kept returning to Judge Carter. "She's showing us all how it's done," he said softly to no one in particular. "How to stand up to hate without becoming hateful." The courthouse, usually bustling with the day's activities by this hour, remained in a state of suspended animation. Cases would be delayed, meetings rescheduled, routines disrupted. But something more important was happening. In the wake of an ugly incident, people were coming together, talking about things that usually went unspoken. Judge Carter stood in the center of it all, her presence a reminder of what justice really meant. The bruises on her arm would fade, but her response to this moment would leave a lasting mark on everyone who witnessed it. The morning's events had transformed from a story of prejudice into a lesson about dignity, justice, and the power of responding to hatred with wisdom. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting its light through the courthouse windows, it illuminated more than just the marble floors and wooden benches. It showed something transformative happening. A moment of darkness being turned into an opportunity for light, a demonstration of how justice should work, not just in theory but in practice. The day was far from over, and there would be much work to do. But something had shifted in the courthouse that morning, something more profound than just one officer's actions or one judge's response. It was the beginning of a change that would ripple out far beyond those marble walls, touching lives and changing perspectives in ways that were just beginning to unfold. The next few days at the Montgomery County Courthouse buzzed with unprecedented activity. Judge Carter's office had become the center of a quiet revolution in how justice was administered. Rather than pressing personal charges against Officer Miller, she had chosen a different path, one that would lead to lasting change. The morning after the incident, Judge Carter arrived at her usual early hour. The security team practically fell over themselves apologizing, but she waved off their personal apologies. "This isn't about making people feel guilty," she told them. "It's about making sure we do better." In her office, she sat at her desk reviewing security protocols that hadn't been updated in 15 years. Coffee grew cold beside her as she made notes, identifying gaps that went far beyond one officer's actions. Every now and then, she would pause to rub her arm where Miller's grip had left a bruise, not out of pain, but as a reminder of why this work mattered. The chief judge had given her full authority to implement changes. Down the hall, a conference room had been transformed into a command center of sorts. Charts covered the walls, tracking everything from security training procedures to complaint histories. A young law clerk had created a timeline of similar incidents from other courthouses, revealing patterns that had gone unnoticed for years. "Look at this," Judge Carter said to the courthouse administrator, pointing to a stack of incident reports. "We've had complaints before, but they were handled individually. We never looked for patterns." Her voice carried no accusation, just a determination to uncover the truth. The police chief arrived for a meeting, his face grave as he reviewed the security camera footage. "This goes beyond just one officer," he admitted, watching Miller's aggressive behavior play out on screen. "We need to look at our entire training program." Judge Carter had already prepared a comprehensive proposal. "We need more than just diversity training," she explained, spreading documents across the conference table. "We need to change how we think about security itself. Protection shouldn't mean intimidation." In the courthouse lobby, subtle changes were already visible. Security officers had begun greeting visitors with more warmth, taking extra time to explain procedures. The metal detectors and scanning equipment remained, but the atmosphere had shifted from confrontational to professional. A senior court officer, who had worked in the building for 20 years, gathered his team for a morning briefing. "What happened to Judge Carter could have happened to anyone," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But not everyone has her position or power to fight back. That's why we have to be better." The district attorney's office had launched its own investigation, but Judge Carter insisted on being involved in a different way. "We're not looking for punishment," she explained during a staff meeting. "We're looking for transformation." Outside her chambers, a steady stream of visitors arrived, other judges, lawyers, court staff, even defendants who had appeared before her. Each had their own story about experiencing prejudice in the justice system. Judge Carter listened to them all, taking notes, building a fuller picture of what needed to change. The Courthouse maintenance worker who had witnessed the incident stopped by with a fresh pot of coffee. "Judge," he said quietly, "people are talking, not just here, but in the community. They're saying maybe things can really change this time." In the law library, a group of legal interns pored over cases involving courthouse security and civil rights. Judge Carter had asked them to research precedents, not for a lawsuit, but for guidance on creating better policies. Their enthusiasm was infectious. They knew they were part of something important. The police department had placed Officer Miller on administrative leave, but Judge Carter insisted on meeting with his supervisors. "I want to understand how he was trained," she said, "what messages we're sending to our officers, both direct and indirect." A week after the incident, she called her first meeting of the newly formed Courthouse Access and Dignity Committee. The conference room was packed. Judges, lawyers, security officers, community leaders. The energy in the room crackled with purpose. "What happened to me was public," Judge Carter began, standing at the head of the table. "It was witnessed by dozens of people. But discrimination happens every day in smaller ways, to people who don't have my platform or position. Those are the people we need to think about as we do this work." The committee got to work immediately. They reviewed security procedures from courthouses across the country, looking for best practices. They studied complaint patterns, interviewed staff and visitors, and began drafting new protocols that would balance security with dignity. In her chambers late one evening, Judge Carter sat reviewing the day's progress. The bruise on her arm had faded, but her determination had only grown stronger. On her desk lay dozens of letters from people sharing their own stories of facing discrimination in courthouses and other public spaces. A knock at her door revealed the courthouse administrator carrying fresh statistics. "The new greeting protocols are already making a difference," he reported. "Complaints are down, and we're actually processing people through security more efficiently." Judge Carter nodded, but she was already thinking ahead. "This has to be more than just a response to one incident," she said. "We're building a new model for how justice should work, from the moment someone walks through those doors to the moment they leave." The sun was setting, casting long shadows through her office windows. Another long day was ending, but the work was really just beginning. What had started as an ugly confrontation was transforming into something powerful and lasting, a real chance to make the justice system live up to its highest ideals. Outside her window, she could see people leaving the courthouse for the day. Each person who passed through those doors deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. Thanks to one difficult morning and the response it inspired, they were one step closer to making that a reality. 6 months had passed since that fateful morning at the Montgomery County Courthouse. The changes that had begun in those tense moments had rippled out far beyond the building's marble walls, touching lives and transforming institutions in ways no one could have predicted. On a bright spring morning, Judge Carter stood at the courthouse entrance, watching as people moved through the newly redesigned security checkpoint. The difference was striking. Security officers greeted each person with respect, explaining procedures clearly and calmly. The lines moved efficiently, but more importantly, people didn't feel intimidated or threatened. "It's like a different building," whispered a public defender to her colleague as they passed through. She'd been practicing law here for decades and had seen the transformation firsthand. The change wasn't just in procedures, it was in the very atmosphere of the place. The morning light streamed through the high windows, illuminating the new information boards that had been installed in the lobby. Clear, multilingual signs explained courthouse procedures and people's rights. A digital display showed wait times and docket information. Everything was designed to make justice more accessible, more transparent. In her office, Judge Carter reviewed the latest statistics. Complaints about security incidents had dropped by 70%. More importantly, surveys showed that people felt more confident about coming to court, more trustful of the system. The numbers told a story of real change. The courthouse had become a model for others across the country. Delegations from other cities regularly visited, studying the new procedures and training programs that had emerged from that difficult morning. Judge Carter made time to meet with each group, sharing not just what they'd done, but why it mattered. "Remember that maintenance worker who saw everything that day?" she asked during one such meeting. "He told me last week that his grandson wants to be a lawyer now." That's what real change looks like, when people start to believe that justice is truly for everyone. The training program they developed had spread to police departments and courthouses in 3 neighboring states. It went beyond traditional diversity training, focusing on practical scenarios and real-world situations. Officers learned not just what not to do, but how to handle difficult situations with dignity and respect. In the law library, a thick binder held hundreds of letters from people sharing their experiences with the new system. "For the first time, I felt like a person in court, not a problem to be dealt with," one writer had said. Another wrote, "I was nervous about my court date, but the respect I was shown made all the difference." Officer Miller's case had been handled exactly as Judge Carter had promised, not through punishment alone, but through education and reform. After completing an intensive training program, he had become an advocate for change in his own right, speaking to other officers about his experience and what he'd learned. The courthouse security chief, who had been devastated by the incident, now led workshops for other security teams. "We learned that real security isn't about showing power," he would tell them. "It's about creating an environment where everyone feels safe and respected." Judge Carter's response to the incident had become a case study in judicial ethics training. Law students now studied how she had transformed a moment of personal humiliation into an opportunity for systemic change. Her words from that morning were quoted in textbooks. "Justice isn't about revenge or punishment, it's about learning, understanding, and growing." The young clerk who had witnessed everything that day was now heading up the courthouse's community outreach program. She organized regular meetings between court staff and community members, building bridges of understanding that made the justice system more accessible to everyone. In the jury assembly room, a new orientation video showed people what to expect when they came to court. It emphasized that every person, regardless of their role or reason for being there, deserved to be treated with dignity. The script had been carefully crafted based on feedback from hundreds of court visitors. The changes weren't just superficial. Deep structural reforms had taken root. Every policy, every procedure was now viewed through the lens of dignity and respect. Even the physical layout of the courthouse had been modified to be more welcoming and accessible. One morning, Judge Carter arrived to find an elderly woman waiting near her chambers. The woman's granddaughter had been a defendant in her court years ago. "I saw what happened to you on the news," the woman said, "and then I saw what you did about it. My granddaughter's in law school now because of you." These moments reminded Judge Carter why the work mattered. Every person who walked through those courthouse doors carried their own story, their own hopes for justice. The system needed to serve them all, not just those with power or position. The morning sun still streamed through the courthouse windows, just as it had on that fateful day. But now it illuminated something different, a place where justice wasn't just an ideal, but a living, breathing reality. A place where dignity wasn't just a word, but a practice. As Judge Carter prepared for another day on the bench, she thought about how one ugly moment had sparked such profound change. The bruise on her arm had long since faded, but its impact would be felt for generations to come. In the end, that was what real justice looked like, not just punishing wrongs, but transforming them into opportunities for growth and change.